At 12, she was given away, moved like a pawn on the chessboard of power. At 13, she was forced to become a mother, her fragile body nearly breaking under the weight of childbirth. That child would rise to become Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. But for Margaret Beaufort, the cost was a body marked by pain, a heart wrapped in silence, and memories that would not release her. Was it sacrifice for a crown, or the quiet tragedy of a girl destroyed by her own time? The Wars of the Roses were not merely battles of men in armor, clashing banners, or crowns won and lost on muddy fields. They were also wars fought in silence, through marriages arranged, children bartered, and futures stolen before they could even begin. In the heart of this storm stood a fragile figure, Margaret Beaufort. Born in 1443, Margaret was no ordinary child. She belonged to the Beaufort line, descendants of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. Though legitimized by royal decree, her family always carried the faint shadow of illegitimacy, a reminder that their blood was both noble and contested. In the turbulent politics of 15th century England, this made her less a daughter than a prize, something to be bargained, exchanged, and positioned on the board of dynastic ambition. By the time she was 6 years old, men twice her age debated her future as if she were a piece of land or a stack of gold coins. By 10, suitors had already been whispered in her ear, not because of affection, but because her inheritance was too tempting for families eager to strengthen their claim to the throne. Childhood toys, if she ever had them, were replaced with lessons in scripture, estate management, and obedience. Instead of learning to play, she learned to kneel. Instead of games in the courtyard, she was trained to endure silence, to carry burdens she could not yet name. In the great halls of her youth, Margaret's presence was small but never overlooked. Noblemen would pause to observe her, thin, solemn, dark-eyed, calculating not who she was, but what she represented. She was a girl with a fortune, a claim, and therefore a risk. Her body, her very existence, was political capital. It was as though every step she took was shadowed by the weight of England's uncertain crown. There is a cruelty in watching a childhood close too soon. Margaret did not run through castle gardens as freely as other children. She was not shielded from the endless bargaining of noble houses. Her life was written in contracts, stamped with seals, dictated by the wills of men who barely noticed her trembling hands as she signed away the fragments of her future. Imagine her world. Stone walls echoing with prayers recited at dawn, tutors drilling her in piety, elders reminding her of her duty. When she looked out through narrow castle windows, the field stretched wide and untamed. But for her, the view was more dream than possibility. Beyond the glass was freedom, the laughter of children whose lives were not wrapped in politics. Yet inside, her path narrowed, every choice preordained. At 12, Margaret's fate was sealed. Her guardians arranged her marriage to Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. The decision was not hers, nor was it delayed to spare her youth. It was swift, clinical, inevitable. She became the pawn that her family's bloodline demanded her to be. The ink dried on the parchment, and with it, her childhood ended. How does a girl process such a loss? Perhaps she prayed harder, believing that God had chosen her for a destiny larger than herself. Perhaps she wept in silence, clutching her rosary while other children her age clutched toys. Or perhaps she grew still, her emotions turned inward, hardening her spirit for the years of trial to come. History does not record her private tears. It records only the contract, the title, the promise of a womb that would soon be tested. What lingers most is the image. A girl, so small, so unprepared, standing at the window of her chamber, gazing out at a horizon she would never reach. The sky above England stretched open, limitless. But for Margaret Beaufort, the world was already closing in. Every corridor narrowing toward duty, every prayer whispered toward survival. The wars of men raged outside. But within the walls of her own life, another war had begun. The war between girlhood and the crushing demands of power. And as Margaret pressed her forehead against the cold glass, she must have wondered, not whether she would be free, but whether she would endure. Marriage, for most, is the union of two hearts. For Margaret Beaufort, it was the erasure of one childhood. At the tender age of 12, she was led into a marriage arranged not by affection, but by calculation. Her husband was Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI, chosen not because he cared for her, but because her inheritance and bloodline could strengthen his family's fragile position in the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. To the men who negotiated this alliance, she was not Margaret, a girl with fears, longings, or dreams, but a vessel for power, for heirs, for the continuation of a dynasty. Picture the wedding. Not the white dress of romance, nor the warm glow of candles celebrating love. Instead, imagine a cold chamber, priests reciting solemn vows, elders nodding with satisfaction, scribes marking down the details of land and title. Margaret's small figure, barely a woman, stood cloaked in rich fabric that weighed more than she did. Her eyes lowered, her lips pressed into silence. Perhaps her hands trembled beneath the veil, though no one dared notice. For them, this was victory, a union sealed. For her, it was surrender. Marriage was not the end of the burden. It was the beginning. Within months, whispers turned into commands. The young bride must conceive. She must prove her worth, not with words or wit, but with her body. And so, by the time she reached 13, Margaret was already heavy with child. Consider what that means. A body still growing, bones not yet formed to bear such weight, suddenly forced into the agonizing labor of pregnancy. The halls of her castle must have echoed with unease. Servants watched her small frame move slowly, her steps shorter, her face paler. Every day, she carried within her not only a child, but the crushing weight of expectation. The kingdom looked upon her belly and saw promise. She looked upon it and felt fear. When the time of birth arrived, it was not joy that filled the chamber, but terror. The air smelled of sweat and wax, the flicker of candles casting long shadows across anxious faces. The midwives gathered, whispering prayers as Margaret screamed, screams too large for such a fragile body. Her bones strained, her skin burned, her very life teetered on the edge of death. At 13 years old, she entered the valley where so many women of her time had perished, the valley of childbirth. Imagine her hands clutching the sheets, her cries muffled by the walls, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Each contraction tore through her like a storm, and with every wave, she may have wondered, will I survive this? Will I ever see another sunrise? She was a girl forced into a woman's trial, her body stretched to its limits, her soul trembling on the boundary between life and death. And then, at last, the cry of a child. A son. Small, fragile, but alive. Henry Tudor had entered the world, swaddled not only in linen, but in the destiny of a dynasty. The chamber filled with relief, with whispered thanks to God, with satisfaction among the men who waited outside. To them, this was triumph. To Margaret, it was survival. Barely. But survival left scars. Her small body was never the same. The ordeal of childbirth at so young an age left her pelvis altered, her frame weakened, her gait forever marked with a limp. She would never bear another child again. At 13, her body had been broken by the very act that fulfilled her duty. At 13, she was already both mother and widow in waiting. For fate was merciless. Edmund Tudor, her husband, did not live long after their son's birth. He succumbed to the plague, leaving Margaret alone, an orphaned widow with an infant son, both vulnerable in a kingdom ripped apart by civil war. Imagine her now, a girl barely past childhood, cradling her newborn in arms that still trembled from labor, standing before a future as uncertain as the very throne her son was destined to one day claim. This was the crucible that forged Margaret Beaufort. Not coronations or courtly dances, but the silent agony of a birth that nearly killed her. The sudden weight of motherhood thrust upon shoulders too narrow to bear it, and the cruel blow of widowhood before she had even reached womanhood. Her story was not one of choice, but of endurance. In those long nights after Edmund's death, when the castle grew still and the child stirred beside her, Margaret must have whispered prayers that trembled with desperation. She had given England a future king, but what had England given her? A body broken, a girlhood stolen, a loneliness deeper than any chamber's shadow. Yet there she was, a 13-year-old widow clutching her son like the last candle in a darkened hall, knowing that the world outside would not spare them, knowing that her suffering was not the end, but only the beginning. And so part 2 closes with this haunting image. A pale, thin girl kneeling beside a cradle, tears mingling with whispered prayers, as the child within, tiny, fragile Henry Tudor, sleeps, unaware that his existence has cost his mother everything. Childbirth gave Margaret Beaufort both everything and nothing. Out of her agony came a dynasty. Out of her agony came a wound that would never heal. When Henry Tudor entered the world, the midwives whispered that God had shown mercy. They wrapped him tightly, held him to the light, and declared that he lived, fragile though he seemed. But for Margaret, mercy came wrapped in chains. The birth that gave her England's future king also took from her the possibility of bearing another child. Her small, underdeveloped body had been pushed beyond its natural limits, and though she survived, she was left scarred. From that day forward, Margaret walked with a limp. Her pelvis, strained and altered by the violence of birth, made each step uneven, as if the earth itself tilted against her. Pain became her constant companion. It was not loud pain, not the kind that demands cries or moans, but the silent, persistent ache that shapes a person's entire existence. She could no longer move freely without remembering the price of her survival. Every corridor, every staircase, every walk through the chapel was accompanied by the echo of her own body's betrayal. The physical injury bled into her spirit. She was only 13, and already she knew her body would never bear another heir. This truth haunted her like a shadow, for in a world where women were valued for their fertility, she had fulfilled her duty once, and only once. The irony cut deep. She had brought forth a king, yet the act left her permanently broken. What was celebrated as triumph for her family was, in truth, a lifelong sentence for her. And then, death struck again. Edmund Tudor, the husband chosen for her, the man whose name had bound her to this destiny, succumbed to the plague only months after Henry's birth. Margaret, barely out of childhood, found herself widowed, with an infant in her arms and no protector to shield her from the storm of politics. The girl who should have been shielded by family now became the shield herself, standing between her fragile son and a world eager to exploit or destroy him. Picture the scene. Margaret, still weak from childbirth, kneeling by a cradle. Her limp forcing her to move carefully, she lowers herself to pray. Her thin fingers trace the wooden edge of the cradle as her lips whisper desperate petitions to God. The child inside, Henry, stirs and lets out a faint cry. She pulls him close, rocking him gently despite the sharp pull of pain in her hips. Her tears fall onto his swaddling cloth, mixing sorrow with faith. This was not simply motherhood. It was sacrifice turned into survival. And yet, the paradox of her life burned cruelly bright. Henry was both her ruin and her hope. Because of him, she would never again walk with ease. Because of him, her youth had been stolen, her body maimed, her life reshaped. But also because of him, she carried a reason to endure. He was the fragile candle in her storm, the promise that her suffering was not meaningless. She could hate him, she could resent him, but she could never let him go. In him, her tragedy and her salvation were intertwined. As the years unfolded, this paradox would grow heavier. The Wars of the Roses tore England apart, and Margaret's son became a target. His existence threatened rival dynasties, and his safety was never secure. Yet she clung to the belief that God had spared her in childbirth for a reason, that Henry's survival was no accident, but a divine design. Every limp, every ache in her bones, every restless night became proof to her that she was chosen to bear this burden. But the human heart does not endure such contradictions without scars of its own. Margaret lived with the constant reminder that the son she adored was also the son who had stolen her youth. Was Henry her blessing or her curse? Did she give birth to a king, or did she sacrifice her very self so that others could wear crowns she would never touch? These were the questions that tormented her in the silence of prayer. Questions that had no answer but lingered like ghosts in her soul. Her loneliness deepened the wound. At 13, she should have been surrounded by childhood friends, laughter, and the gentleness of family. Instead, she sat in dark chambers, her husband's absence weighing heavy, her body aching, her only company a fragile infant who demanded everything she had left. Her prayers, whispered endlessly, were not only for her son's safety, but for her own strength. "Lord," she must have pleaded, "give me the endurance to walk this path, though it was never mine to choose." This is where Margaret's story differs from countless other girls forced into premature marriages. Many died in childbirth, their names forgotten, their bodies buried with silence. Margaret lived. And in living, she carried both the triumph and the torment of survival. She was a reminder that endurance can be more harrowing than death. That to live broken is sometimes a heavier cross than to die whole. The image remains seared into history. A young widow, body limping, spirit fractured, kneeling beside a cradle in dim candlelight. She weeps not only for her lost childhood, but for the uncertain road ahead. Her son's tiny breaths fill the room, each one a reminder of both hope and loss. And in that fragile space between mother and child, dynasty and ruin, Margaret Beaufort's tragic destiny begins to unfold. The Wars of the Roses did not care for widows, nor for fragile boys who had not yet learned to walk. They were wars without mercy, clashes of steel and blood that consumed families, burned estates, and turned children into pawns of ambition. For Margaret Beaufort, these wars were not distant tales sung by bards. They were storms battering the walls of her life, threatening to tear away the one treasure she had left, her son. Henry Tudor was still a child. Yet even as an infant, his existence was a political statement. His blood linked him to the House of Lancaster, the dynasty then crumbling under the relentless rise of York. Every cry he made, every fragile breath, every heartbeat was a reminder that the battle for England's crown was not only being fought on muddy fields, but also in cradles and nurseries. And for Margaret, that realization bred fear as deep as the marrow in her bones. She was no longer merely a girl robbed of her childhood. She was a mother in a battlefield she could not control. The death of her husband had left her exposed. Male guardians were appointed to oversee her lands and her child. But guardians were not protectors. They were opportunists, each calculating how best to use her and her son to strengthen their own cause. Margaret became a woman walking a tightrope, bound by duty, hemmed in by power, desperate to shield her son while unable to truly command his fate. Consider the setting. A castle dimly lit, the air thick with whispers. Servants move silently, their eyes lowered, aware that danger lurks beyond the gates. Margaret, limping slightly as she moves through the corridors, clutches her son close. Outside, the winds of war howl. Banners of York flutter against Lancaster red, blades sharpen in preparation for the next clash. And within the walls, a mother prays, her voice breaking. Not for victory, but for survival. The burden of motherhood during war is crueler than any sword. To nurture a child is to offer him peace. But peace was a luxury Margaret did not have. She could not cradle Henry without imagining soldiers tearing him from her arms. She could not sleep without hearing the echo of armored boots in the halls. She could not even trust her own household, for loyalty shifted with the winds of power. Was her son's laughter a sign of life, or a sound that might soon be silenced? And yet, Margaret endured. She made alliances, bent when she had to bend, hardened when she had to resist. Her piety grew sharper, her prayers more urgent, as though every bead of the rosary carried the weight of her son's survival. She understood that Henry was not only her child, he was Lancaster's last hope, the fragile ember of a dynasty smoldering toward extinction. To protect him was to protect more than blood. It was to guard the possibility of a crown. But in this devotion lay another torment. For Margaret, the line between love and duty blurred until it nearly vanished. Did she cling to Henry because he was her son, or because he was her destiny? Did she rock him gently out of maternal tenderness, or out of desperate calculation? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps her heart was torn in two directions at once, each beat carrying both love and ambition, faith and fear. The wars grew bloodier, their noise echoing even into the quiet chambers where Margaret knelt. She could not fight with swords, but she fought with silence, with patience, with prayers that seemed to scrape against the very throne of heaven. In the stillness of night, she imagined futures for Henry. A boy sent into exile, a man hunted by rivals, or, just perhaps, a king. But those futures all shimmered like ghosts, impossible to grasp. What she held was the present, a small, frail child asleep in her arms, and the knowledge that the world outside would not spare him. There is an image that history does not record, but that imagination cannot forget. Margaret fleeing through the corridors of a castle, the clamor of steel outside. Her son pressed tightly against her chest, the air heavy with smoke, the cries of men dying in the distance, the pounding of her own heart echoing like drums of war. She stumbles on her weakened hip, but does not stop. Behind her, walls tremble. Before her, shadows stretch. Yet she does not let go of Henry. In that moment, she is not a pawn of dynasties, but a mother willing to run through fire to keep her child alive. It was this paradox that defined her. Powerless in the eyes of kings, yet powerful in her endurance. She could not command armies, yet she commanded her will. She could not shape the outcome of battles, yet she shaped the survival of her son. She was trapped by politics, yet she fought her own war, an invisible war, a war of patience and prayer, of whispers and sacrifices, of bloodless wounds that cut just as deep. In the Chronicles of Men, the Wars of the Roses are measured by victories and defeats, by Bosworth and Towton, by the clash of steel. But in Margaret's life, the war was measured by nights of restless prayer, by footsteps echoing in empty corridors, by the weight of a child who represented both salvation and doom. She was not a soldier, but she bore scars all the same. And so, Part 4 closes with the image of Margaret Beaufort standing in the shadows of her chamber, her son sleeping in her arms, while outside the storm of dynasties rages. She gazes into the darkness, her eyes reflecting both fear and fire, knowing that her fight has only just begun. Pain does not vanish when the body heals. It lingers, settling into the marrow, shaping every breath, every movement, every thought. For Margaret Beaufort, childbirth had left more than scars. It had branded her life with a permanent reminder of suffering. She could never walk a corridor without feeling the uneven pull of her limp. She could never rise from prayer without the dull ache of her hips. Her body had become a prison, and yet it was within that prison that her soul was forced to endure. As Henry grew older, Margaret's devotion to him grew sharper, almost desperate. But devotion carried its own torment. Every time she looked upon her son, she saw not only a child of promise, but the memory of her near death. Henry's face reminded her of a night when she was certain she would not survive, of screams that shook the walls, of the agony that had shattered her youth. To cradle him was to cradle both love and loss. To kiss his forehead was to taste both hope and haunting. It was a paradox she could never escape. Henry was her lifeline, the reason she endured the cruel tides of politics. Yet he was also the reminder that her youth had been stolen, her body broken, her choices denied. She lived in the constant tension between gratitude and grief. Did she thank God for sparing her in childbirth? Or resent him for binding her to a lifetime of pain? Perhaps both, whispered in alternating prayers, tears soaking into her folded hands. The world saw her as a pious widow, a woman of dignity and quiet endurance. But beneath that composed exterior, her soul waged an unending war. She limped not only in body, but in spirit. At night, when silence fell across the castle, her thoughts circled like vultures. Was my son my salvation, or my destruction? Did I give birth to England's future, or did I sacrifice my entire existence for a destiny that will never belong to me? These were not questions she spoke aloud, but questions that carved themselves into her heart. Her piety deepened, as though she sought to bury her anguish beneath layers of prayer. She spent long hours in chapels, her knees pressed into cold stone, her hands tracing rosary beads until her fingers ached. The echo of her whispered prayers filled the chambers like a haunting refrain. And yet, even prayer brought no complete relief. Faith gave her strength, but it also deepened her sense of destiny, convincing her that her suffering was not accidental, but divinely ordained. To believe she was chosen gave her endurance, but it also chained her to the thought that escape was impossible. Margaret's limp became more than a physical reality. It became a symbol of her life. Every step reminded her of the cost of her motherhood. Every step reminded her that her path was not straight, but crooked, marked by pain. People might have pitied her in silence, whispering that her body was frail, that she was weaker than other noble women. But they did not see the fire beneath the fragility. Margaret carried her pain like armor, letting it harden her resolve. If her body was broken, her will was not. Still, the cost was heavy. The isolation of her youth never lifted. Even as she engaged in politics, negotiated alliances, or planned her son's safety, there remained a hollow space within her. A space carved out by the absence of choice, the absence of joy, the absence of the simple life denied to her. She would never again bear another child, never again feel the innocent freedom of girlhood, never again know the companionship of a marriage built on affection. Her existence was defined by a single act of survival, and everything after it was but an echo. History often glorifies sacrifice, painting it in noble colors, but the truth is darker. Sacrifice leaves scars. Sacrifice leaves hauntings. For Margaret, her sacrifice was not a moment, but a lifetime. The dynasty that would one day rise under her son's crown was built upon her broken body, upon nights of tears whispered into the void, upon the hollow echo of dreams unfulfilled. And yet, the paradox returns. For if Henry was her curse, he was also her shield. He gave her a purpose that lifted her above obscurity. Without him, she would have been another forgotten widow. Another broken girl lost in the margins of history. With him, she became the mother of a dynasty, the silent architect of a throne. Her haunting was also her immortality. There is an image, perhaps imagined, perhaps true, that captures this torment. Margaret kneeling by Henry's bed as he sleeps, her hands clasped, her lips whispering prayers. Her eyes glisten with tears, not from the glow of devotion, but from the weight of questions she cannot answer. She watches her son's chest rise and fall, and in that rhythm, she feels both the beating of her hope and the echo of her suffering. And as the candle beside the bed burns low, the shadows creep along the wall, stretching long and silent. Margaret's face is half in light, half in darkness, like her life itself, caught between triumph and tragedy, devotion and despair. Exile is not always measured in distance. Sometimes it is measured in silence. For Margaret Beaufort, the years when her son grew up far from her side were a kind of living exile, even though her body remained in England. Henry Tudor, the fragile child she had nearly died to bring into the world, was carried across seas into Brittany for his own safety. She remained behind, anxious, limping, praying. Caught in the dim corridors of power, her heart stretched across the Channel. The Wars of the Roses had grown bloodier. Lancaster had fallen. The Yorkists under Edward IV ruled the throne. For Henry, it was safer to live under foreign roofs than to risk being crushed beneath the boot of York's victory. And for Margaret, this was torment. She had given her entire body to this child. She had borne scars that screamed every time she walked, and yet she was denied the comfort of raising him. Her motherhood became a thing of shadows. Letters exchanged through guarded hands, rumors of his health, whispers of his survival. She was his mother, but at a distance too vast to cross. What does a mother do when her arms are empty, but her heart is full? For Margaret, the answer was prayer. She turned every chapel she entered into a battlefield of faith, every rosary bead into a weapon against despair. She whispered Henry's name as though it were both plea and promise. The flicker of candles became her only company, their smoke rising like her unending petitions. In the silence of cloisters, her voice cracked against stone walls, asking God not for wealth, not for peace, but for the single life of her son. The people around her must have thought her piety excessive. They saw a widow cloaked in black, always kneeling, always fasting, always weeping softly into her hands. They could not know that behind the veil of devotion was a woman haunted by absence. Every bead of her rosary was not a general prayer. It was a mother counting the days, the months, the years she had lost with her only child. And yet, she endured. Endurance became her language, her armor, her survival. She navigated courts carefully, neither too bold to provoke suspicion, nor too silent to be forgotten. She cultivated alliances, befriending nobles when it was useful, withdrawing when it was dangerous. She lived in a world of whispers and half-smiles, always walking a tightrope where one wrong step might destroy not only her, but also the son she carried in her prayers. There is a cruelty in such waiting. The years did not grant her rest. They sharpened her longing. Henry was growing, changing, becoming a man in lands she could not touch. She imagined his face, taller now, broader perhaps, but still carrying the fragility of his beginnings. Did he remember her? Did he resent her? Did he know that every limp in her step, every hollow in her body, was a mark left by his birth? These questions haunted her more than the clash of swords or the rise of kings. The irony was brutal. Margaret had given England its only hope for a future Lancaster king, yet she lived as though she were powerless. She had no husband to protect her, no household to call her own, no daily joy of holding her son. She walked through shadows, watched from the margins, waited for a future that might never come. It was as though her entire existence had narrowed to one long pause, a life suspended until the moment Henry might return. But waiting is not the same as passivity. Within her silence, Margaret plotted. Within her prayers, she planned. She cultivated loyalty to her son among those who still whispered the name Lancaster in defiance. She built a network of allies quietly, cautiously, always disguising her ambition behind the veil of piety. To the world, she was a widow devoted to God. To those who looked closer, she was the mother of a claimant, playing a game as subtle as it was dangerous. Still, the nights were the hardest. In the stillness of her chamber, the fire dimming low, her body aching from years of pain, she would sit alone and think of the child who had cost her everything. She must have wondered, was it worth it? Was my suffering meant to light his path? Or will he vanish into exile and leave me with nothing but scars? History leaves us no record of her private tears, but they linger in imagination. We can see her kneeling in the faint light of dawn, her lips moving through a prayer repeated so often, it had become part of her breath. Protect him, Lord. Let him live. Let him return. Over and over, until the words blurred into sobs, and yet, in that waiting, in that silence, in that exile of the soul, Margaret forged a strength few could match. She became the embodiment of endurance. Every shadow she walked through was a rehearsal for the day she hoped would come, the day her son would return to England, not as a fugitive, but as a king. Part 6 closes with this haunting vision. Margaret seated in a cloister, the gray light of evening filtering through narrow windows, her hands trembling as she turns each bead of the rosary. Her lips move in prayer, but her eyes are fixed on the horizon beyond the glass, as though she can see across the sea to Brittany, where her son breathes. Shadows surround her, but she does not falter. She waits. She endures. She believes. There are moments in history when the silence of decades erupts into the thunder of destiny. For Margaret Beaufort, that thunder broke on the fields of Bosworth in August 1485. After years of waiting, after years of limping through shadows and praying through tears, the son she had nearly died to bear returned to England, not as a fugitive, not as a pawn, but as a contender for the crown. The air of England trembled with expectation. Richard III, the last Yorkist king, stood upon the throne, his reign stained by whispers of usurpation, betrayal, and the disappearance of Edward's young sons, the princes in the Tower. His legitimacy was questioned, his enemies circled, and yet he held the crown with the grip of desperation. Against him came Henry Tudor, Margaret's son, a man raised in exile, carrying the fragile hope of the Lancastrian cause on his shoulders. Margaret herself did not ride into battle. Her frail body could not endure the weight of armor or the clash of swords. But in spirit, she was there. Every prayer she whispered in the days before Bosworth was a soldier of its own. Every tear shed in chapel corners was a weapon forged from faith. She may have been cloistered far from the battlefield, but the field itself was an extension of her soul, the culmination of her sacrifice, the reckoning of her endurance. On the morning of battle, the mists clung to the fields. Swords gleamed, banners unfurled, hearts pounded, and somewhere, perhaps in a small chapel, Margaret knelt, her forehead pressed against cold stone, whispering the same words she had whispered for decades. Let him live. Let him rise. History tells us how the battle turned. Richard III, defiant, charged into the heart of the fray, determined to cut down Henry with his own sword. But fate betrayed him. Surrounded, outnumbered, Richard fell, his body beaten into the mud. And with that fall, a crown rolled into history's hands, into Henry's hands. The cry must have echoed across the field. King Henry! King Henry! For the first time, Margaret's son was not a fugitive, not an exile, not merely a boy in the shadows of dynasties. He was King Henry VII of England. For Margaret, the news arrived not with trumpets, but with tears. Imagine the moment. A messenger, breathless from the ride, kneeling before her with the words she had prayed to hear all her life. Your Grace, your son is king. A lifetime of endurance collapsed into a single instant. The girl who had been forced into marriage at 12, who had nearly died in childbirth at 13, who had limped through silence and exile, was now my lady the king's mother. The paradox was staggering. She had never worn a crown herself, but through her suffering, she had placed one upon her son's head. She had never led an army, but through her endurance, an army had marched beneath her prayers. Her broken body, her haunted soul, her endless patience, all had conspired to alter the fate of a kingdom. And yet, victory carried its own shadows. Margaret entered this new role not as a carefree mother basking in joy, but as a woman scarred by years of loss. She had not forgotten the limps in her step, the hollowness in her womb, the decades spent in waiting. Even as she stood near the throne, clothed in rich garments, her eyes remained cautious, her demeanor solemn. She understood better than anyone that crowns were not promises. They were burdens. And she knew that even in triumph, tragedy lurked near. In the court of her son, she was not queen, nor did she wish to be. She was my lady the king's mother, a title heavy with reverence, almost regal in its own right. She did not wear jewels for decoration. She wore them as armor, symbols of the authority she now wielded behind the throne. Her presence became both maternal and political, her whispers shaping policies, her prayers guiding decisions. But if history remembers the battlefield at Bosworth as Henry's triumph, it must also remember it as Margaret's vindication. For without her endurance, without her survival through pain and silence, Henry would never have lived to stand upon that field. Every sword raised for him carried within it the echo of her suffering. Every cry of "Long live the King" was also a cry for the woman who had given England this king at the cost of her own life's joy. There is an image that lingers. Margaret standing at Westminster, watching her son ascend the throne. She does not smile, not fully. Her face is solemn, her gaze sharp. She does not sit upon the throne herself, but she stands behind it, cloaked not in coronation robes, but in a dignity forged through endurance. The courtiers whisper, the nobles bow. But Margaret's eyes pierce through the ceremony. She knows what it took to bring her son here. She knows the cost. And in that moment, perhaps she whispered to herself, half prayer, half rebuke, "I have given England a king, but England has taken everything from me." Part 7 closes with this haunting tableau. The throne room filled with the glitter of triumph. Henry seated in majesty, courtiers rejoicing. And just behind him, in the shadows yet unshaken, stands Margaret Beaufort. She does not wear a crown, but her presence is sharper than steel. Her limp remains, her scars remain, but now her suffering has become power, the silent power of the mother of a dynasty. Power changes shape when it passes through hands that were never meant to hold it. For Margaret Beaufort, the girl who had been forced into marriage at 12, who had nearly died in childbirth at 13, who had limped through decades of shadows, power finally came, not as a crown upon her head, but as influence behind a throne. She became my lady the king's mother, and in that title lay both triumph and emptiness. Henry VII, her only son, ruled England with the cautious wisdom of a man forged in exile. Yet behind his throne, Margaret's shadow loomed large. She was not a silent spectator. She was a counselor, an architect, a strategist. She arranged marriages that would bind families to the Tudor cause, negotiated alliances that would secure the dynasty's fragile beginnings, and whispered in her son's ear with the weight of both experience and maternal authority. Courtiers soon realized that to win favor with the king, one must also honor the mother who had made him possible. In the court's glittering halls, Margaret walked with measured steps, her limp echoing softly across marble floors. Nobles bowed, but not merely out of courtesy. They bowed out of recognition. This was not simply a dowager living out her final years. This was the woman who had endured, the woman whose prayers had carried Henry to Bosworth, the woman whose iron will had shaped the rise of a new dynasty. She had no crown, yet she was cloaked in power. And yet, power did not bring her joy. Her body remained broken, her heart remained hollow. She had only Henry, and though he was king, he was not truly hers. The demands of monarchy had claimed him long ago. At banquets, she sat at one end of the table, Henry at the other, the long stretch of silence between them as heavy as stone. Words were rarely needed. Their bond was undeniable. But it was also a bond scarred by distance, by the fact that Henry was never simply her son. He was England's king. At times, she must have looked across the table and seen not the ruler, not the Tudor sovereign, but the infant she had nearly died to bring into the world. And in that moment, the paradox of her life pressed upon her. She had given England a dynasty, but she had lost the intimacy of motherhood. For while she could command the affairs of nobles, she could never reclaim the small, ordinary joys of raising a child. Henry was hers in name, but in truth he belonged to history. Her piety deepened further in these years, not because she had nothing else to do, but because faith was her refuge against the gnawing emptiness within. She endowed colleges, supported scholars, and funded religious houses. To some, it seemed she had become the very embodiment of sanctity. But behind every charitable gift was a woman searching for peace that power could not give. Her prayers, once whispered in desperation for her son's survival, now turned toward her own soul. Lord, let my suffering have meaning. Let my sacrifice not be in vain. Margaret's relationship with Henry was not without tension. A king must stand alone, must make decisions that sometimes cut against the grain of even maternal advice. And though Henry respected his mother deeply, he knew her influence could stir unease among courtiers wary of her shadow at court, yet he never silenced her. Perhaps because he knew, as all England knew, that without her, he would not exist, neither as man nor as king. Still, Margaret's triumph was bittersweet. She wielded power unseen by any woman of her time. But that power came at the cost of everything else. She had no other children to surround her, no husband to share her burdens, no private life untouched by politics. Her entire identity was fused into one title, the king's mother. To the world, it was glory. To her, it was both crown and chain. There is an image that lingers from these years. Margaret standing just behind Henry as he sits upon the throne. She does not smile. Her gaze is steady, her body cloaked in black velvet, her rosary glinting at her side. Courtiers whisper, recognizing the force of her presence. She does not need to speak. Her silence itself is authority. She is not queen, yet she is something more enduring, the architect of a dynasty's survival. And yet, when the halls emptied, when the banquets ended, when the candles were extinguished, she was alone. Alone with her limp, alone with her prayers, alone with the memories of a body broken too young. Even in triumph, she remained haunted. Even in power, she remained hollow. This is the paradox that history often forgets. That the women who birthed dynasties did so at the expense of themselves. Margaret Beaufort's influence was undeniable, her legacy unshakable. But her personal life was a landscape of silence. Rooms without laughter, meals without intimacy, years without the companionship of family. She was powerful, yes, but she was also lonely. Part 8 closes with this image. Margaret seated at the far end of a banquet table, the gold and silver of the feast glittering under candlelight. At the other end, Henry sits, the crown heavy upon his head. Between them stretches a silence filled not with absence, but with power. A silence that binds mother and son, dynasty and sacrifice, triumph and tragedy. Time is merciless, even to those who bend history to their will. For Margaret Beaufort, the years of power and influence eventually gave way to the slow decline of the body. A body that had been broken since youth. A body that had endured too much for too long. By 1509, she was 66 years old. Her limp heavier, her breath shorter, her bones aching with the weight of decades of sacrifice. She had lived long enough to see her son secure a dynasty. But death was near, and it came not in disgrace or violence, but in the quiet exhaustion of a woman who had given everything. That spring, sorrow struck with brutal precision. Henry VII, her only child, the son for whom she had suffered, prayed, and plotted all her life, lay dying. His reign, which had brought a fragile stability to England after years of chaos, was ending. For Margaret, it was as if the earth had shifted beneath her feet. She had lived her entire existence tethered to Henry. Through her scars, through her loneliness, through her endurance. And now, the thread was unraveling. She was there at Richmond Palace in April 1509 when her son breathed his last. The chamber was filled with courtiers, nobles, and clergy. But for Margaret, the moment was intensely personal. She had once knelt by his cradle, praying he would survive infancy. She had once prayed through his exile, prayed through his battles, prayed through his coronation. Now she prayed through his death, the rhythm of her rosary beads clicking softly against trembling fingers. Henry died at 52, leaving the crown to his second son, the young Henry VIII. For Margaret, it was a wound deeper than any political loss. It was the fracture of her soul. And yet, even in grief, she remained unbroken in will. Within days of her son's death, she oversaw the smooth transfer of power to her grandson. Few women in history have ever wielded such authority at the very edge of mortality. She instructed the household, arranged the ceremonies, and ensured that the Tudor succession unfolded without turmoil. Her mind remained sharp, her influence decisive, even as her body faltered. It was as though she had gathered the last embers of her strength to fulfill one final duty, to safeguard the dynasty she had birthed in blood and pain. But grief cannot be delayed forever. Once Henry was buried, once her grandson crowned, Margaret herself began to slip. She withdrew into quiet chambers, her body collapsing inward, her steps slower, her prayers softer. She was not defeated. No, she had never been defeated. But she was spent, like a candle burned too long, its flame flickering low. Imagine the scene in those final days. A small chamber in Westminster, the walls hung with tapestries depicting saints and biblical trials. Margaret lies in bed, her frame fragile beneath heavy blankets. Her rosary rests on her chest, her lips moving in faint whispers. Around her, the hush of attendance fills the room. But no sound is louder than the ticking of time. She is not afraid. She has long since made peace with death. But there is sorrow in her eyes. Sorrow that her life has been nothing but sacrifice. When death came, it was quiet. No battles, no intrigue, no betrayal, just the silence of exhaustion, the stillness of a body that had carried too much pain for too long. She died on June 29, 1509, only days after her grandson Henry VIII was crowned. The timing was almost symbolic, as if her life had been sustained only to see the crown pass safely to the next generation. And once that duty was fulfilled, she could finally let go. Her funeral was held with a solemnity befitting the mother of a king. In Westminster Abbey, near her son, her body was laid to rest. The coffin was small, draped in black, the weight of history pressing down upon it. Scholars, courtiers, and clergy honored her with words of piety, but behind the ceremony lingered a truth too heavy to speak. Her life had been defined not by choice, but by endurance, not by joy, but by survival. She had birthed a dynasty, but she had paid for it with her body, her childhood, her happiness. In the Abbey's echoing halls, the prayers rose like smoke, but one could imagine another sound beneath them. The the whispers of history itself, acknowledging that this frail woman had done what armies and kings could not. She had outlasted the Wars of the Roses. She had endured exile, pain, and loss. She had carried a son from cradle to crown. And now, at last, she rested. The image that closes this part is stark and solemn. A coffin draped in black cloth, set beside the tomb of Henry VII. No crown rests upon it, no sword lies beside it. Only silence, only the weight of memory. The dynasty lives, but the woman who bore it has vanished into the stillness of stone and prayer, in silence. Her life is a reminder that dynasties are not only built by kings and generals, but also by women whose names are often buried beneath theirs. Women who were forced to grow up too soon. Women who were broken in childbirth, silenced by politics, and remembered not for themselves, but for the sons they bore. Margaret is remembered because her son became king. But how many others? Girls married too young, mothers who died in labor, widows swallowed by shadows, never had their names recorded at all. And so we are left with a haunting image. A woman kneeling in prayer, her body bent, her face lined with pain, whispering words not for herself, but for her son. She was both powerful and powerless, both architect and sacrifice, both saint and prisoner. She was, in the end, human, fragile, enduring, broken, and unforgettable. As your narrator, I cannot help but reflect. Perhaps Margaret Beaufort embodies the quiet truth of history, that behind every throne there is suffering, that behind every dynasty there are bodies that carried the weight, often in silence, and that sometimes the greatest power lies not in the crowns we wear, but in the endurance that no one sees. So I ask you, when we celebrate the Tudors, should we not also mourn the girl who was 12, the mother who was 13, the woman who limped through life so that a dynasty could stand? Was this truly destiny, or was it simply tragedy disguised as history? Her story lingers like a question that has no answer, and perhaps that is the point. If this story of sacrifice and shadows has moved you, I invite you to stay with us. This channel, Dark Ages Unveiled, is dedicated to uncovering the buried tragedies, the forgotten voices, the silent foundations of history that textbooks often ignore. Subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled, so together we can walk deeper into the past, into the dim corridors of power and pain, where forgotten lives still whisper to us. For history is not only about kings who ruled, it is about the mothers, the daughters, and the broken souls who carried them there.